So, hello, viewers and followers. Thank you for joining me today. Today, I'm going to do a couple of things for you. We're going to read the story Robin Hood. The story is Robin Hood and the King. It's an adapted version of the actual story of Robin Hood. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the entire story nonstop without any pause. And then after reading that, I'm gonna go back page by page or section by section and then give you some suggestions on how to discuss this story with your students. So don't go away after I read the story. The reason why I'm segmenting it that way so that you can use my read aloud with your students. You can just keep playing this with your students, and they can listen to it. You can even, take a screenshot of the video so that you can have the text. And then after that, you can use my discussion after reading through the book. You can use my discussion to aid you in planning your lesson. So let's get going. And thank you again for watching. Please do not forget to subscribe so I can continue creating and posting videos like this. Thank you so much. Introduction. Robin Hood and his merry men lived in hiding in Sherwood Forest. Even though Robin and his band were outlaws, they stole only from the rich and gave the money to the poor. Robin thought the corrupt lords were the real thieves. They ruled the land unjustly while good King Richard was off at war. The wicked lords wanted to hang Robin Hood, but they could never catch him. When King Richard finally returned from war, even he could not help respecting this outlaw who fought to protect the common people. King Richard. King Richard loved all sports and those who were good at them. "I wish I could see Robin Hood," said King Richard in his castle. "I wish I could see him and his men shoot and wrestle and show off all their skills. But if they heard the king was coming, they would think that I wanted only to arrest them. They would run and hide deep in the forest, and I would never see them." "I'll tell you how you can see him," laughed one of the king's trusty companions. "Put on the robes of a fat abbot and ride through Sherwood Forest with gold in your pouch. Robin will be sure to offer you a feast so he can steal your money." "I'll do it," said King Richard, slapping his knee. "It will be a great jest." The feast. So the king and 7 of his followers dressed themselves as an abbot and 7 friars. They rode out along the road towards Sherwood Forest. Sure enough, Robin Hood and his men stopped them after they entered the forest and took the king's pouch of gold. But Robin returned 1/3 of the gold to the pretend abbot because he never left any man in need. Robin Hood was pleased with these churchmen because they seemed happy to be in his company. "Now we shall give you a feast that will be worth all your money," said Robin Hood. "I love a feast," said the pretend abbot. "But even more, I would like to see the archery I have heard you are so good at." "You will see the very best we can do," answered Robin. "But, Holy Father, why don't you take off your hood so you can enjoy the sweet evening air?" "Nay, I cannot," answered the pretend abbot. "My brothers and I have vowed not to let our faces be seen during this journey." "Very well then," said Robin Hood. "I interfere with no man's vows." And he never once thought he was feeding the king. Robin and his men gave a splendid feast of roasted meat, fish, and wild birds. The king was very impressed with the delicious food. He had no idea that outlaws could be so well fed and happy. After the men cleared the dishes, they set up for the sports. The archery match. The archery target was a tiny garland of leaves and flowers hanging from a stake far away. "Each of you will have 3 shots," said Robin Hood to his merry men. Anyone who misses the mark will receive a blow to the side of his head as hard as I can give." "Can anyone hit inside that little garland at such a distance?" asked the king. He didn't believe it. "Watch and see, friend," answered Robin Hood proudly. First, David of Doncaster shot all 3 of his arrows within the garland while the king watched in surprise. Then Munch, the miller's son, also shot all his arrows inside the tiny garland. Then Wat, the tinker, drew his bow, but he was unlucky. One of his arrows barely missed the mark. "Come here and take your punishment," called Robin Hood. The king thought Wat would receive only a tap. Instead, he got a blow that knocked him to the ground. "Ha ha ha ha!" laughed his companions. "Oh ho!" laughed King Richard. "I am glad I'm not in this contest." The shooting went on. Most of the men hit the mark, but a few missed and received hard punches. The last to shoot was Robin Hood. His first shaft struck so hard that it split off a piece of the stake on which the garland hung. His second hit barely an inch from the first, but the final arrow he shot was missing some feathers. It flew to one side and struck an inch outside the garland. Then all the men roared with laughter, for they have never seen their master miss before. "Go and take your punishment, master," said Much. "I hope it will be as rough as Wat's was." "Very well," said Robin Hood. "I will take my punishment from our guest." Robin was being clever. He did not like the thought of being knocked down in front of his band. He thought that the arms of a churchman would be soft, for abbots never worked or used their muscles much. But the pretend abbot bared an arm so thick that it made the men stare. King Richard was an active king, and years at war had made him very strong. Robin Hood placed himself in front of him, and the king struck him a mighty blow. Down went Robin Hood, rolling over and over on the ground, while his men shouted with laughter. "Well," said Robin Hood, sitting up, half dazed, "today I did not think there was a person in all of England who could strike such a blow. Who are you, man? I'll bet you're not the churchman you appear to be." King Richard reveals himself. King Richard threw back his hood, and Robin knew it was his king. If he had been a disloyal man as well as an outlaw, he would have trembled. But Robin had always been loyal to his king. He believed that helping the poor people of England was the greatest service he could perform for King Richard. Robin Hood knelt before the king. "Your Majesty," he said, "you have no subjects in England more loyal than me and my merry men. We have done no evil except to the greedy lords who have stolen from your subjects. We beg your pardon if we have done wrong, and we beg for your protection as we always serve you faithfully." The king looked down at Robin Hood. He was amazed that an outlaw should speak so well. He was also impressed that Robin Hood hadn't run away in fear of being arrested. He saw that Robin Hood truly was one of his most loyal subjects. King Richard also knew that Robin was the best archer in England. He wanted him by his side. "Come with me to my court and serve me there," he said. "I will forgive all your crimes and order the nobles to leave you alone. You shall bring 3 of your best men to become knights in my court. The rest of your men will be royal rangers, since I'm sure they can protect Sherwood Forest better than anyone." "With all my heart," replied Robin Hood, and a great roar went up from the merry men. So Robin Hood left the forest and went to the king's court, where he served King Richard as well. His men became rangers of the forest and protected the land and its people. The common folk of England never had to suffer under the rule of wicked lords again. The end. I hope you enjoyed this reading of Robin Hood, an adapted version. Even though this is not the complete story and has been simplified, it's still as enjoyable as it is. So in this introduction alone, you can create multiple questions as a point of discussion with your students. For example, if you look at the word corrupt, that's already defined in the glossary. However, you can also work at the words unjustly. Unjustly is a word that your students may or may not know. So that is something that you want to define for your students. Another thing that you can point out is ask the students at this time, they can determine what type or what kind of a character is Robin Hood from the information that is given on that page. So you can ask your students, based on the information that is given on this page, what kind of a character is Robin Hood? You can also ask what kind of a character or what kind of people are the lords. On this section, where its focus is on King Richard, we can ask questions about the type of character King Richard is. They don't really specifically, or the author does not specifically describe King Richard. However, there's a lot of things that we can glean or that you can ask the students to get a sense of what the type of character King Richard is. You can refer the students to the illustration, the kind of person he is by the way he stands, the way his mannerism is. We know for sure that King Richard loves sports. So if a person loves sports, what kind of build would they have? You can also ask whether King Richard at this point respects Robin Hood and his merry men. So those are some discussion questions that you can have with regards to this section where King Richard is. In this section where it says the feast, you can ask the students to sequence the events. You can ask them what happens first and then what happens next and after that and after that. So this is a good sequencing section because of the fact that there's a lot of action in this section. You can also ask more things about the type of people that live in the Sherwood Forest. What kind of people Robin Hood is, what kind of person Robin Hood is, and his merry men. Okay, so that's something that you can also delve into the characterization. And you can ask at this point, you probably determine along with your students that Robin Hood is the main character or is he a good character. You can ask your students, find evidence in this section that supports why Robin Hood and his merry men are good people. All right. You can also ask about the feast. You can have the students describe what the feast is. Now, contextually, meaning you can connect this easily with your students, especially if you are a Filipino teacher or you come from a culture where we treat our guests with everything that we have, we provide with food. So you can ask them what kind of a guest or host Robin Hood is in terms of providing such a feast to their guests. Another important thing that I want to point out that shows Robin Hood's character is that after stealing the gold, Robin Hood did not take all the gold, correct? He gave some of it back. And you can ask your students, why did he do that? And you can ask your students, would you have done the same thing if you were in Robin Hood's situation? So in this section where the archery match, you can discuss the type of soldiers or the type of archers the merry men are, how skillful they are. And then you can ask them, why are the merry men and Robin Hood so good at archery? Why are they excellent? And here's another thing. Remember when Robin Hood missed the mark and he took the punishment? You can again ask him, what type of a character is Robin Hood? Because he's the main character, right? He's also the one who's supposed to be very skillful, but yet he missed. And then he took his punishment like everybody else. So ask your students, would you have done the same thing? Even though you are the boss, all right, or you are the leader, would you have subjected yourself to that punishment? You can also ask some question, why King Richard really punched Robin Hood hard, right? As hard as he could. Okay? So, and that also, you can also ask a question, the significance of the king's arm. You can refer the students to the illustration. Why is the king's arm so thick, right? So muscular. So you can ask that with your students. Okay? At this point, you can begin asking in terms of the surrounding, the environment, the setting. Ask your students to describe those. You can also ask the students if they have some clarifying questions, if there's some confusion in their head about the story. All right. It's always good to encourage your students to ask questions themselves. In the conclusion of the story, King Richard reveals himself. Now, in this part, it really tells us what type of a loyal servant Robin Hood is. So you can ask how Robin Hood reacted. If you were in the same situation as the king, would you have forgiven Robin Hood? Right? And then you can ask why Robin Hood kneeled and submit himself to the king, because he could have just easily either ran away or perhaps even injured the king, right? But he didn't. He kneeled down. And then at the same time, here's an interesting thing. What the king did, ask your students, how come the king pardoned Robin Hood and gave Robin Hood and his merry men important position in his court, right? So you can go back to your students. So what does that tell you about the king? What kind of a character is the king who does something like that, even though Robin Hood has broken the law, right? So as a further discussion, you can discuss with your students depending on how old they are. If they're towards like probably grade 5, 6, 7, 8, or in high school, because you can still use this in high school because we have some high schools that are low readers, right? You can ask them in terms of the difference or the fine line between what is right and what is wrong, right? So imagine this. Robin Hood is stealing, right? He's stealing, but he's stealing from the rich. So that's kind of like a moral ambiguity, right? Does it make it right if you steal something and you give it to the poor? Because stealing is stealing. When is stealing correct? When is stealing not correct? Stealing is always correct, and that's something that you can go further and discuss with your students. That's also right, like what do you call this? Kind of a lesson for moral values. Having that discussion with your students. When is stealing correct? When is stealing not correct? Or stealing is always wrong, right? So that's something that you can just talk about and come up with myriads of examples in the present society that you live in. Parents and teachers, what I would do with a story such as this one is I would really prepare maybe 4 or 5 questions that could get your discussion started with your students. This story obviously is an adapted story. It's different from different versions. There's a lot of versions of Robin Hood. All right, this is a version in the movie Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. This is not the same. All right, it's an adapted version, but the characters are pretty much the same. Okay, because in other version, the King Richard and Robin Hood never met in the forest. In fact, in some version, King Richard was never around. Right? So you can introduce the students different versions of the story. For the upper kids, there's actually a very famous movie with Kevin Costner in the I believe it was during the 1990s or late 1980s. And in that Robin Hood, it's one of my very favorite movie. It's a different version of this story. There's some recent movies in Netflix that is an adapted version of the Robin Hood. So it's okay. It is okay to show the clips of those movies or even the entire movie as a set off for discussion or as a comparison, just to get them engaged in reading. So, thank you very much for watching. Maraming salamat po sa panonood. Hanggang sa muli.